Hi, welcome to the Betsy Giacaruso Studio and Gallery in Rhinebeck, New York. I'm Betsy, and I'm going to take you through a tutorial for basic watercolor painters or beginning watercolor painters about how to show form in your paintings. Whether you're doing a building, a still life, it's important to know how to describe form and have it show up in a painting. So we're going to borrow a concept from the old masters called the 5 planes of light. So I have a setup. I've used some white forms, and we're going to paint with one color so we can focus on value alone. Value means no color. It's just a range from light to dark. Lights and darks are very important to the basic structure of a painting. And by learning a little bit about the 5 planes of light, it should make your job a lot easier when tackling some of these things in your subject matter. So I've already got a drawing set up. You can see my still life with the white forms that I have here. You're going to want to learn how to set up your forms or your objects with the light coming from one side. You really want it to be slightly in front, slightly to the side, so you have cast shadows from each. You can also set up a shadow box, which I often do, but for simplicity's sake, I've left them open air. But you can control the light a little more if you create a shadow box made out of foam board at an angle like this that you can set your objects in. But this tells the story about the light just fine. So I've also got the drawing going. So since this is not really about drawing in perspective, we want to keep it simple and do the best you can with the drawing. I actually, for my students, you can always practice doing your sphere freehand, but if you don't want to take a lot of time and you want it to be perfect, it seems to me that the center of the masking tape roll works perfectly. So you've noticed, you want to pay attention to certain things when you're setting up your drawing. Which object is closest to you or the viewer? So look at the bottoms of these objects to try and get your drawing set up properly. You want to make sure that your sphere is not too far back so that it would actually be inside your cylinder or the cube. It's nice to have each of them overlapping a little bit, because every time you have an object overlapping another, it adds more depth to your painting. So another hint with your drawing, you can use a straight edge to get all your verticals. You can also use a straight edge to get these angles and be somewhat consistent without getting into real details of perspective. But these verticals will all be straight and the same. The ellipses, you will just take note that the bottom ellipse is a little deeper. It's wider than the top ellipse, because the top ellipse is closer to our eye level, which makes it narrower. We're looking down upon it, but not as much as the bottom one. So once you've played with your drawing and are happy enough with it, it doesn't have to be perfect. This is a tutorial in watercolor, not drawing. I like to draw through the sphere. It's a lot easier to get the cylinder correct if you don't stop. Get the whole thing even. You can even draw a line down the center of it to make sure you're centered, and then erase it later. Once I'm happy with my drawing, I will erase anywhere that overlaps my sphere. Oops, one thing I forgot is the cast shadow on my little sphere on top. So I've used a different material for the form for the box because I like the detail on it. It gives me an opportunity to practice 5 planes of light on another smaller ball, and it's fun to do. So here is a rendering that I did in pencil of the 5 planes of light with just a sphere, but clearly it's a little easier to create this with pencil. than it is with watercolor. Well, watercolor is challenging, but that's the fun of it, and the imperfections sometimes in watercolor make it a most delightful medium to work in. So, let's get started. We are going to use one color. Let's use ultramarine blue. You're going to pull a little color out into your palette. And with watercolor, it's a good idea to think from light to dark. Once you've lost your lights, they're hard to get back. So we want to try and see where the shadows are. I'm just going to quickly go over the 5 planes of light, and then I can describe them a little bit as we paint as well. So sometimes they're considered the 6 planes of light, but let's start with the highlight. The highlight is the lightest part of the object. When your light source is from the left, it's going to be about 1/4 of the way in, and where the object is closest to the light, it almost obliterates the local color there. So you get what's called a highlight. The same way you get a gleam on a vase, where it's shiny, it picks it up even more and obliterates the color. But at any rate, this is the highlight. Then we have the mid value or shadow. So the right-hand side of the object, you'll see, is in shadow. And it looks very much like the crescent moon, when you see a crescent moon, the shape of that shadow. The crescent moon shows up when the sun is hitting one side of the moon, or the light from the other side. And then you get the shadow on the opposite side. So we have the shadow, and then we also have what's called the camber. The camber is the darkest part of the shadow side, and it's usually right in close moving toward the highlight. I often refer to it as the DMZ, where all the action takes place. It's where the object curves more suddenly away from the light, so it's the darkest. The camber is the darkest area of the shadow side. Then we have reflected light, right up under here. Your light source is coming down. It's also hitting the top plane that your object's sitting on, and bounces back up, creating some reflected light. The reflected light is always beautiful, very subtle and beautiful. And it will contrast against the dark value or no light under the object. So when we want to refer to them as the 6 planes of light is when they separate the cast shadow and consider that separate. Otherwise, we can consider all this shadow. And again, the accent or no light is in that crevice right up underneath where no light gets. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is always identify your light source when you're looking at your subject matter. Our light source is coming from above and the left. It also, if you create a shadow box, it's going to hit over here. If you keep this area behind your subject matter lighter, it tells a story about the light. The light is coming from this side when you see it hitting over here. So we're going to end up vignetting this side. But let's focus on the objects first. So I'm going to pull some paint out, and then I can control how light it is by adding more water and going very light and delicate. So you want to look at let's first start by looking at the cube, the box or the cube. Identify the lightest side, which is the left. The top is the next dark, and the darkest side is over on the right. So the light is hitting the top, but at this angle, it's not as bright as the front side of the box. So it's almost like a highlight on this whole front side of the box. So we're going to use the white of the page for that. And we will put our first wash on the top. And I'm going to make it a very delicate blue. It's easy to overshoot in value, but we want to keep in mind that it is a white box. So let's try and go light. And you'll notice that I painted right over that shadow, because in watercolor you really want to paint the shadow in over the whole surface. Otherwise you'll have a cutout and it'll feel separate and not cast on top of what's there. So I'm going to let that dry before I do the shadow side. So in watercolor, often you'll be moving around the painting to let an area dry. If you want an edge to bleed into another one, wet on wet, then you can go right in. But if you want it to stay crisp, then you're going to let that dry before you come in. So let's move to the sphere. So let's lay in the cast shadow. Trying to get that angle as best you can, and think of it as painting the outer surface of something and see it three-dimensionally if you can in your mind. Imagine as you're painting it that it is three-dimensional, and that's why I'm using strokes that follow the form. And then while it's still wet, I can actually go in and suggest the camber and let it bleed in. Now you can keep a crisp edge here, or you can soften this edge as well. So, and we have to remind ourselves that we are trying to create an illusion on a flat piece of paper. So we're using these tricks that we learned from the old masters, and sometimes what we want to do is make it more real. And once you learn these basics of the 5 planes of light, you're going to try and have your subject matter have the proper lighting and information, but if it doesn't and it's not ideal, you can invent it. It gives you more freedom. So by putting the camber in, we already have a little bit of reflected light here. But we may want to enhance it by lifting just a little. And you don't want to go in too soon, because if it's too wet, then you'll disturb the wash. Or if you go in with a very wet brush, then you'll create a blossom. So this gets us started on the sphere, and I can come back later and build another layer afterward. All right, let's move over here to the cylinder. So let's first try and get in the shadow side. Using vertical strokes, I'm going to soften this edge before it dries. Hopefully you can get back to that before it dries. And then once you have this nice wet on wet wash, you can go back in with just a little bit more paint, a little bit darker value, while it's wet, and get your camber in. So you get that nice, using your wet on wet technique to suggest your camber that moves all the way down. So we have the highlight is hitting the left side, and that also allowed for a little reflected light over here. So now this is dry enough. I'm going to move back to the box and put in my shadow side. So you're really trying to calibrate as best you can to get these values right. If you feel like you've made it too light or too dark, you can always come back when it's dry or use a hair dryer to dry it and put a glaze over it and take it one step darker. So that might be just a little dark. But we have the idea of the reflected light, which is going to be over here. So I'm going to pull this paint over and have it get lighter as we move across. And it's best if you try and nail it and keep it simple so you don't have to keep reworking. In watercolor, you really want things to be as fresh as possible. You have some time to rework things, but if you continue to go in once it starts to dry, that's when we get in trouble. So, we have our camber on this edge, although I don't want it to be a line, so I'm going to add just a little more dark so it becomes more like an edge. You can also use gravity if you want it to blend a little more by tipping your board. Okay, then we'll let that dry. Now, while we're here, let's just put our ellipse shadow on the little ball on top. So once you get to understand these concepts, it's actually a lot of fun. So I can drop a little extra paint in to suggest the camber. If it's too wet, then it may bleed out too much and you will lose the dark that you just put in. So as you go back in, just try and be mindful not to be wet with your brush and use a little pure pigment, and hopefully that will do the trick. I just want to soften this edge a little bit, and you can always restate your camber. So, and you can also do some cleaning up, like I can clean up these edges, but you're best to wait until they dry because that's gonna, if you put water there, it's gonna bleed into the box. Okay, so let's think about cast shadows. Cast shadows is where the light is blocked by the object itself. And you want to create the illusion that the cast shadow moves away from the object. So I like to start at the back sometimes. And I try to make sure I don't go too dark because I want the back edge to be lighter. And you can keep your edges crisp on the ellipse. Or sometimes you can soften the ends so it feels like it's disappearing in space. Now, I want to use a little pigment that doesn't have as much water as I pull the rest of this up under the sphere to capture the accent or no light. So this gradually moves away in space by using the value and having it get lighter. Now, as this dries, I'm going to be able to go under here and make it even a little darker to really nail that accent. And that's really going to have it feel like it's got weight and is sitting on the surface. So let's quickly do these other cast shadows. And in this case, we just have the table ending there. So we're just going to put atmosphere in behind there. So pull the dark underneath. Use the tip of your brush to get narrower. You can clean up any edges afterward. It's usually safer to wait. Okay, but I have my suggestion of gradation from light to dark. And then I also have a cast shadow from the cube or the box. around the edge of the sphere and pull that shadow into the crevice. So you see, by going dark in this little crevice in the corner, it has it move away in space, and the light gets darker as it gets tucked under there. We have one more little shadow. Up here, hopefully the sphere is dry enough. And then when that's a little drier, I'm going to drop in the accent, or no light, underneath. In the meantime, I could take a little darker pigment and suggest the crevice underneath the box, and I'm going to do it in a lost and found way. And I'll also suggest the opening that the box opens by doing a little lost and found edge under there as well. So there's just a couple little things to finish up with. If you want to go back in and bump up your camber here, you can do that. This may not be quite dry, so if you're going to do that, you might hit it with the hairdryer just to make sure, but I can enhance anything here. So I can keep it simple. If I do want to show a more specific highlight, then I have to go with a very light wash in here and suggest that that area is just a little bit lighter. Okay, let's go under here. Hit the accent or no light. So you could get a little harder edge on that if you wait till it's dry. So these aren't quite dry. So doing it while it's wet is always safest, or while it's totally dry, because you can do wet on wet, but when it's totally dry, you can also put pigment in on top and then rinse and dry your brush and blend it out. Blend that edge into what you had. All right, the last thing I'm going to do to finish this up, you can leave it like this or give it a little bit of background where it's dark behind there, the negative space. Also will help to tell a story about the light. So I'm using a bigger brush. I've switched to my flat brush. And what you want to be careful of is to not have the value exactly the same all around these. And you want to avoid lines. Lines will get rid of the suggestion of form. Lines flatten form. So we want to try and avoid lines. We want edges of value, one against another. And so we can go a little darker over here. And then as it moves over toward the right, we're going to show the direction of the light. And you can always just suggest the edge of the table here. And then I'm going to soften that line and make it more of an edge. And that's it. You can always use the edge of your paper towel to soften edges before they dry. I like to leave, on this exercise, I like to leave the white of the page in the foreground. The light is also hitting, especially right in front of your objects. The light is coming down, hitting them and this area. So you want that to contrast. Anyway, that is the 5 planes of light. So have fun, and thanks for joining me. Okay, so once you have completed the color triad exercise and the 5 planes of light, you could take a couple of pieces of fruit, something simple. I would suggest lemons or pears. Lemons are probably going to be more simple, or they're going to be simpler as far as color goes. Set them up the same way you did, with light from one side, and you can paint them using the color triad and practicing the 5 planes of light. Thanks for joining me. This is Betsy from the Betsy Jackarusso Studio and Gallery in Rhinebeck. Happy painting.